On a misty morning, Han returned to his village after years away. The fog clung to the paths and dampened the leaves of old oak trees he had climbed as a boy. At the edge of town stood an abandoned dock by the river where boats used to be pulled up every night. Now it was quiet, save for the sound of the water lapping gently against rotting wood. Han walked slowly, his steps soft on the muddy ground. A young woman approached him with a basket over her arm and a baby in a sling across her chest. She seemed out of breath, the child fretful and crying softly. The woman's eyes met Han's briefly. Then she turned away to look at the river. "Excuse me," she said without turning around. "Would you mind helping me get this basket onto the dock? I'm afraid my hands are full." Han nodded, stepping closer. He took the basket from her and carried it carefully across the wet planks of the old dock. The woman thanked him quietly, then reached for the basket. Han stopped her. "Let me carry it for you," he said. The woman hesitated, but finally let him hold both the baby and the basket. Her hand lingered on his arm for a moment before she stepped back. They stood there in silence for a while, looking at the water. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing patches of the river's surface and the reflection of the sky above. Han noticed how the woman held her child close with one hand while cradling the basket in the crook of her elbow. She seemed to be listening intently. "Thank you," she said again after a time. "It means a lot." Han nodded, but he did not speak. He looked at the way her fingers were intertwined protectively over the baby's head, as if sheltering it from the world beyond their little island of peace in the fog. The child had stopped crying and was now sleeping. The woman finally moved, shifting her weight and adjusting the sling so she could carry both items herself. She took a deep breath before speaking again, her voice low but clear. "Can you take me to the village? I've lost my way," she lied gently. Han didn't question her. He simply nodded and turned toward town, leading the way with his hands full of basket and child. The woman followed behind him, holding herself upright, her head bowed slightly against the damp air. They walked for a while in silence until they reached the main street, where people were beginning to stir. Han handed over the baby and the basket to an elderly woman sitting at a stall selling bread and eggs, who took them without a word and watched as the pair continued on their separate paths through the village. Han turned back toward his old home, but he paused before entering. He looked one last time at the woman walking away from him, her steps steady despite the fog and the weight she carried. She stopped suddenly, turning to wave back at Han without calling out. Then she disappeared around a corner, leaving only the faint echo of the water lapping against the riverbank behind her.
You're listening to the Empty Teahouse. Somewhere across the river, a dog barked into the dawn. In the quiet alley between two clay walls, the air was thick with damp earth and faded flowers.
In the quiet alley between two clay walls, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and faded flowers. At one end, a weaver sat hunched over her workbench, fingers moving slowly through skeins of thread. She had just finished weaving a rug for the local schoolhouse but found herself reluctant to take it inside and start anew. Across from her, on the opposite side of the alley, stood an old door slightly ajar. The weaver's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, came out of her house carrying a small basket filled with herbs she had picked in the early morning light. Her face was soft yet determined, as if she knew what lay ahead and was prepared to meet it head-on. She glanced towards the weaver but said nothing, instead moving past her and stepping into the alley. The weaver watched Mrs. Chen walk by, her hands steady despite the weight of the basket. The older woman placed a few herbs near the door that opened onto an unseen room within her house. Then she turned back to face the weaver. There was something in Mrs. Chen's eyes, a kind of quiet assurance that spoke volumes without words. The weaver stood up and walked towards Mrs. Chen, stopping beside her at the doorstep. "May I help?" she asked softly, holding out her hand toward the basket. Mrs. Chen nodded but shook her head. "No, thank you," she said gently, placing a hand on the weaver's shoulder instead. The gesture lingered longer than it needed to before Mrs. Chen let go and stepped back inside without another word. Left alone in the alley, the weaver felt a subtle shift within her. She turned to look at the herbs laid out beside the open door, pale green leaves and twisted roots that seemed both delicate and enduring. Her fingers brushed over them lightly, almost accidentally, yet with clear intent. The weaver then returned to her workbench, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if following a rhythm she had just discovered. She picked up one of the dried herbs from Mrs. Chen's doorstep and brought it closer to examine its intricate patterns closely before laying it down beside her unfinished rug. As the day continued, the weaver worked steadily but paused occasionally to listen to the world around her, birds calling overhead, distant voices from a nearby market. Each moment seemed infused with a sense of clarity she hadn't noticed before. Toward evening, the weaver stepped outside again and found that Mrs. Chen's basket was empty. The herbs were no longer there beside the door, they had been taken inside where their purpose would be fulfilled. A small gust of wind stirred up dust from the alley floor as if acknowledging a change neither woman spoke about. Back in her own home, the weaver put away her tools and stood by the window, watching the sun set behind the clay walls beyond her house. She thought about the day's quiet exchanges and how they left an echo in everything she touched and saw around her. In that moment, she picked up a thin stick lying on the floor and used it to draw a simple shape into the dust outside her door, a circle within another larger one, reflecting the quiet harmony of Mrs. Chen's herbs and their unseen use.
The weaver's breath misted in the cooling air as she looked out at her simple drawing, then turned to light a single candle. In the quiet hours before dawn, Liang sat by the riverbank where boats were pulled up at night.
In the quiet hours before dawn, Liang sat by the riverbank where boats were pulled up at night. The mist swirled around him, thick and cold. His hands worked steadily on a small fishing net, mending the tears that snags from debris had made during last night's catch. Beside him, an old man named Wei leaned against a nearby tree trunk, watching Liang with patient eyes. Wei rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were like whispers carried away by the wind. A distant splash broke the stillness of the early morning air. "The fish must be awake," Liang said without looking up from his work. Wei nodded slowly and then reached into a worn satchel slung across his shoulder. He withdrew an old book, its cover tattered from years of wear and tear. With careful fingers, he opened it to a bookmarked page. "I found this passage last night," Wei said softly, reading aloud. "Even the bitterest spring rain will eventually be followed by sunshine." Liang glanced at him but returned his attention to the net. He understood what Wei was trying to say without needing words. The old man closed the book and placed it gently back into the satchel. "It's a reminder," he said, more to himself than Liang, "for when the cold is too great or your hands are too sore." Liang grunted in acknowledgement but made no comment on Wei's reading. Instead, he offered him some tea from his flask. They drank silently as the morning light slowly stretched across the sky. After a while, Wei looked out over the water and then back at Liang. "When you mend your net," he said, pointing to the intricate knots Liang was tying, "do you ever think about why you do it?" Liang paused in his work, considering Wei's question. He could see the boats were starting to fill with fishermen preparing for the day. A chill breeze blew across the water, sending ripples through the surface. "I fish because I need food," Liang said finally, "and when my net is torn, it must be mended." Wei nodded as if he expected this answer. He pointed at his own body, then to a nearby rock, indicating that he was old and could no longer work like Liang did. His hands were too weak. "I used to fish," Wei said quietly, "but now I read." There was no resentment in Wei's voice or face, only acceptance. Liang glanced at the fishing net and smiled faintly. He held out his hand, inviting Wei to sit beside him as he continued his work under a pale sky, both of them waiting for the sun to rise. The morning fog began to clear and Liang heard the distant sound of footsteps approaching the riverbank. Another day was beginning, but in that moment before dawn, when all was quiet and still, he felt something within himself settle, like the water after a storm. Wei closed his eyes briefly as if taking a deep breath of contentment from the early morning air. Then he opened them again, looking at Liang with an unspoken understanding between them. As Wei leaned back against the tree trunk once more and Liang picked up his needle, they shared the quiet riverbank together, each to their own tasks but in harmony with the day about to unfold. A bird took flight from a nearby bush, its wings making a soft whooshing sound that seemed almost to say goodbye as dawn officially arrived.
Somewhere across the river, a dog barked into the dawn. The morning was still when Li Mei entered her candlemaker's workshop.
The morning was still when Li Mei entered her candlemaker's workshop. She lit a small lamp and set it on the old wooden table that had been in the family for generations. The room filled with the faint scent of wax and beeswax, a familiar comfort. Outside, the world moved at a different pace. Today, she had heard a rumor about a new trading post opening nearby. People whispered about possibilities, wider markets, higher profits, the chance to make candles that could be sold across cities and villages alike. Yet here in her quiet space, Li Mei felt no urgency. She rolled up her sleeves, dipped wicks into melted wax, and began shaping small pillars. At midday, a knock sounded at the door, a rare occurrence. She set down her work and opened it to find an old neighbor, Lin Tao, standing on the threshold with a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. "Li Mei," he said, eyes softening as they met hers, "I heard you make candles of remarkable quality." She nodded, inviting him inside without words. He stepped in, and she noticed how he paused, taking in the scent that had become her home's signature. "Can I be honest?" Lin Tao asked, looking around at the workshop. "There's a new trading post opening up today. Everyone's talking about it. Some say it'll change everything." Li Mei offered him a seat as she busied herself with finishing a candle she'd started earlier. She didn't need to look up to see his reflection in the half-finished pillar, the worry lines on his face. "Would you like one?" Li Mei asked, holding out a newly made candle. "I can show it to you." Lin Tao took it gently and held it close to examine it. The flickering flame danced off the smooth surface of the wax, casting soft shadows around them. He seemed to study each curve and angle with meticulous care. "I understand why people are excited," he said slowly, turning the candle in his hands. "But what does that mean for someone who finds content in their own routine?" Li Mei smiled softly, placing another candle on the table beside him. The act was a simple offering without any explanation needed. She went back to her work, leaving the question floating between them. Lin Tao sat quietly then, watching as she worked, rolling wax into shapes with practiced ease and dipping wicks into molten pools of melted beeswax. The rhythmic sound of dripping wax filled their quiet space, a symphony in its own right. After some time, he spoke again, this time softer than before. "Do you ever think about those big changes? About being part of something bigger?" Li Mei paused briefly, then continued her work without looking up. Instead, she handed him another candle, different from the first, but equally well made. He took it with a quiet appreciation. "The candles will be there," Li Mei said, "whether made here or at a grander place." Lin Tao nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes as he held both candles carefully now. Outside, the sun had begun to sink below the rooftops of the old town, casting a warm glow through the small workshop window. He placed the candles on the table and stood up, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," Lin Tao said quietly, looking at her. She watched as he left, closing the door softly behind him. The room felt a little fuller now, as if imbued with something more than just waxed pillars. It was filled with silent conversations between them. Li Mei picked up one of the candles and began to polish it lightly with her fingers, watching the smooth surface catch the fading light from outside. In that moment, She noticed how even in stillness, there could be a quiet strength.
The door's shadow lengthened against the wall as evening fell. The day was cold and clear when Hannah walked to the orchard in late autumn.
The day was cold and clear when Hannah walked to the orchard in late autumn. The trees stood bare against a high blue sky, their branches reaching out like ancient hands asking for something they can't quite name. A quiet wind stirred leaves that had fallen long ago into neat piles around each tree. At the edge of the orchard, she met an old woman who sold tea from her little cart parked beside an overgrown path. The woman's eyes were sharp and knowing behind faded spectacles. She smiled without words when Hannah approached. "Hot tea," said Hannah. "I have it." The woman opened a steaming thermos and poured hot water into 2 small cups, placing them on the table next to her cart. The steam rose like prayers in cold air. They sat there together for a time drinking tea without speaking much. The sound of dried leaves crackling beneath boots was all that filled the silence between them. After finishing their tea, Hannah rummaged through her satchel and pulled out a small wrapped package. She offered it to the old woman with no explanation, who accepted it with an understanding nod. The old woman unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a scarf, woven in colors that seemed to capture the warmth of summer evenings long past. Hannah watched quietly as the older lady slipped the scarf around her neck and tied it loosely at her throat. "Thank you," said the old woman softly. "Now go home." Hannah stood up, feeling somehow lighter than before. She walked down the path back towards town, the bare trees lining either side of the way standing tall against a clear sky. The old woman remained seated by her tea cart, now wrapped in Hannah's scarf. As Hannah turned onto another road leading to her village, she noticed the faint sound of a bell coming from somewhere near the orchard, a tiny chapel hidden behind rows of trees where travelers sometimes left offerings. She had never heard it ring before this day. The soft chime lingered like unanswered questions in crisp autumn air. Hannah walked on, not thinking about much at all, but feeling something different within her chest, a subtle shift she couldn't name yet. And so she continued walking back to the village where everything was waiting for her, just as it always had been, except now perhaps with a small change nobody else would notice.
The bell's soft chime faded as Hannah turned the corner, leaving behind the orchard and the old woman by her tea cart. A path winds back through mist and memory. The kettle cools at the empty tea house. Until tomorrow.